Hello there, my gentle friend. Welcome to another peaceful evening with your sleepy long scientist. Tonight, we're going to explore something that might seem a little scary at first: nuclear accidents, and when atoms go wrong. But I promise you, by the time we finish our quiet journey together, these mysterious atomic stories will feel like old friends sharing their secrets under starlight. The word nuclear often makes us feel worried, doesn't it? But atoms are everywhere around us, even in the air we breathe as we settle into sleep. They're usually so well behaved, dancing their ancient dance in perfect harmony. Tonight, we'll discover what happens when that dance gets a little too energetic, and how humans learn to guide these tiny particles back to their peaceful rhythm. So pull your blanket close, and let's begin. When I was a child, I remember driving through the countryside with my family and seeing those tall, mysterious cooling towers in the distance. They looked like giant concrete flowers reaching toward the sky, with gentle white clouds drifting from their tops. My young mind wondered what magical things happened inside those towers, and why grown-ups spoke about them in hushed, careful voices. Perhaps you've had that same curious feeling when you've seen nuclear power plants, or heard the word radiation whispered like a secret. There's something deeply human about our relationship with atoms and nuclear energy. Our great-grandparents learned to live with fire, taming it from wild flames into gentle hearth warmth. Our grandparents discovered electricity, bringing lightning safely into their homes. And now, we're learning to live peacefully with nuclear power, understanding how to guide these invisible atomic forces with wisdom and care. Every breath you take contains atoms that are older than our planet, particles that once danced inside ancient stars. These same atoms power our cities, heal our bodies in hospitals, and sometimes teach us difficult lessons when things don't go as planned. Understanding nuclear accidents isn't about feeding our fears. It's about replacing worry with gentle knowledge. When we know how atoms work and why accidents happen, we can sleep more peacefully, knowing that each incident has made nuclear technology safer for everyone. These stories of atomic mishaps are really stories of human learning, courage, and our endless capacity to grow wiser from our mistakes. Let me tell you a gentle secret about atoms, my dear friend. Imagine for a moment that everything around you, your soft pillow, the warm air you're breathing, even the sleepy thoughts drifting through your mind, is made of tiny, invisible universes. These universes are so small that millions of them could dance on the tip of a single eyelash, and each one contains its own perfect little solar system. At the center sits a nucleus, like a cozy sun made of protons and neutrons snuggled together, while electrons orbit around it like peaceful planets in their eternal dance. These atoms are incredibly ancient storytellers. The carbon atoms in your body once lived inside a star that died billions of years ago, gently spreading its gifts across the cosmos. The oxygen you breathe was forged in the heart of stellar furnaces, and the iron in your blood was created when massive stars exploded in spectacular, distant fireworks. Every atom around you has traveled through space and time to be here with you tonight, carrying the memory of cosmic adventures in their tiny cores. Most atoms are wonderfully well behaved, like children who have learned to play nicely together. They hold hands with their neighbors, forming molecules and materials that stay stable for thousands or even millions of years. The atoms in a rock by the sea are content to remain exactly as they are, weathering storms and sunshine with quiet patience. But some atoms, particularly the heavier ones like uranium, are naturally restless spirits. They're like elderly storytellers who occasionally need to share a piece of their ancient wisdom, and when they do, they release a tiny burst of energy and transform into something new. This transformation is what we gently call radioactivity, and it's actually happening all around us in the most natural way. The Earth itself is slightly radioactive, warming our planet from the inside with the gentle energy of atoms, slowly changing over millions of years. Your body contains naturally radioactive elements like potassium and carbon, which have been part of the circle of life since the beginning of time. Bananas are radioactive too, in the sweetest, most harmless way, nature's little reminder that atoms are constantly, quietly doing their ancient work. Nuclear energy is simply our way of encouraging certain atoms to share their stored energy a little more quickly and in a controlled way. Think of it like tending a very special campfire where instead of burning wood, we're helping uranium atoms split apart and release the starlight they've been carrying for billions of years. When a uranium atom splits, it's like watching a gentle firework in reverse. instead of an explosion. It's more like a tired giant quietly exhaling, releasing warmth and light that can power entire cities. The beautiful thing about atomic energy is that it's incredibly concentrated. A single uranium pellet the size of a fingertip contains the same amount of energy as a ton of coal. It's as if nature has packed entire forests of energy into these tiny, invisible particles, waiting patiently for us to learn how to unlock their gifts responsibly. This is why nuclear power plants can generate enormous amounts of electricity using relatively small amounts of fuel, and why nuclear medicine can target specific parts of our bodies with incredible precision. But here's where the story becomes more complex and interesting. While most atoms are content to change very slowly over thousands of years, when we encourage them to release their energy more quickly, we need to be very careful about how we manage this process. It's like the difference between a gentle stream flowing through a meadow and a rushing river during spring floods. Both are water, both are natural, but they require different kinds of attention and respect. The atoms involved in nuclear reactions don't become evil or dangerous. They simply become more energetic, like children who've had too much sugar and need gentle guidance to calm down. The radiation they emit is their way of gradually returning to a peaceful state, shedding excess energy like a hot stone cooling in the evening air. Understanding this helps us see nuclear accidents not as atomic monsters awakening, but as situations where our careful management of atomic energy needs improvement. This is why learning about nuclear accidents is so important and comforting. Each incident has taught us more about how to work harmoniously with atomic energy, how to build better safety systems, and how to help atoms dance their ancient dance in ways that benefit humanity while keeping everyone safe. Tonight, as we explore these stories together, we're really learning about the patient relationship between humans and the most fundamental forces of nature. Picture a nuclear power plant as the most carefully tended garden you've ever imagined, where instead of growing flowers, we're cultivating the gentle release of atomic energy. The heart of this garden is the reactor core, a peaceful chamber where uranium fuel rods sit quietly in perfectly arranged rows, like sleeping giants waiting for their moment to share their ancient starlight. These fuel rods are filled with uranium pellets, each one containing the compressed energy of millions of years, patiently waiting to transform into the electricity that lights our homes and warms our hearts. The process of nuclear fission is really quite beautiful when you understand it gently. Imagine uranium atoms as wise old storytellers who have been carrying the same tale for billions of years. When a tiny neutron, think of it as a curious child, approaches one of these uranium storytellers, something magical happens. The uranium atom becomes so excited to share its story that it splits apart, releasing not just energy, but also new neutrons that go dancing off to find other uranium atoms to excite. It's like one person starting to laugh in a quiet room, and soon everyone is gently chuckling together, creating a warm, controlled chain reaction of shared joy. But this atomic conversation needs careful guidance. Just like any good discussion, this is where the control rods come in. They're like gentle hands that can reach into the reactor core and slow down the conversation when things get too animated. Made of materials that absorb neutrons like a soft blanket absorbs sound, these control rods can be inserted deeper into the core to quiet the atomic chatter, or withdrawn slightly to let the conversation flow more freely. It's a delicate dance of give and take, requiring skilled operators who understand the moods and rhythms of atomic energy. The water that flows through a nuclear reactor serves as both a gentle conductor and a protective guardian. As it circulates around the fuel rods, it carries away the heat generated by the splitting atoms, like a cool stream flowing through a sun-warmed meadow. This water also helps moderate the speed of neutrons, slowing them down so they can more easily find other uranium atoms to dance with. It's a beautiful example of how nature provides exactly what we need: water that cools, moderates, and protects, all at the same time. The electricity we use in our homes begins its journey in the steam generators, where the heated water from the reactor creates gentle clouds of steam that turn massive turbines. These turbines are connected to generators that convert the spinning motion into electrical energy. Much like a bicycle dynamo creates light as you pedal, the steam then condenses back into water and returns to begin the cycle again. in an endless loop of atomic energy, becoming the power that charges our phones, lights our rooms, and keeps our food fresh. The entire nuclear power plant is designed with what engineers call defense in depth, multiple layers of protection that work together like a family watching over a sleeping child. The fuel pellets are enclosed in metal cladding, which is surrounded by the reactor vessel, which sits inside a containment building with walls several feet thick. Each layer provides backup protection, so that, even if one system has a problem, others are ready to step in and keep everyone safe. It's like having multiple blankets on a cold night if one slips off. Others are there to keep you warm. Nuclear power plants also have emergency systems that activate automatically if anything unusual happens. These systems are designed to work, even without electricity, using the natural force of gravity and the physics of heat and pressure to ensure safety. It's as if the plant itself has been given instincts for self-preservation, knowing how to shut down safely and cool itself even in the most challenging circumstances. The development of nuclear power was driven by humanity's desire to find clean, abundant energy that didn't depend on burning fossil fuels. In the 1950s and 1960s, nuclear energy was seen as a gift from the atomic age, a way to harness the same force that powers the sun to meet our growing energy needs. The early pioneers of nuclear power worked with careful optimism, believing they were creating a technology that would provide clean electricity for generations to come. What makes nuclear power so remarkable is its incredible efficiency. A single nuclear power plant can provide electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes, using just a few tons of uranium fuel per year. Compare this to a coal plant that might burn millions of tons of coal to produce the same amount of electricity. It's like the difference between a small, steady candle that burns for months and a bonfire that consumes an entire forest in a single night. This efficiency means that nuclear power produces very little waste and creates no air pollution during operation, making it one of the cleanest forms of large-scale electricity generation. We have, on a gentle spring morning in 1986, the city of Pripyat near the Ukrainian border was awakening to what seemed like an ordinary Saturday. Children were playing in courtyards, families were planning weekend activities, and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant hummed quietly in the background, as it had for years. The plant's reactor number 4 had been scheduled for a routine safety test, the kind of careful procedure that nuclear engineers perform regularly to ensure everything works properly. It was meant to be a simple exercise, testing whether the reactor could safely shut down if the electrical power was lost. Nobody could have imagined that this gentle test would become the most significant nuclear accident in history. The RBM reactor at Chernobyl was a particular type of nuclear reactor that used graphite blocks to help moderate the neutron dance we talked about earlier. Think of it as a massive, carefully arranged pile of graphite bricks, with channels running through them where fuel rods and control rods could be inserted. This design had been used successfully in many Soviet power plants, but it had some unique characteristics that required very careful operation. Unlike the reactors used in many Western countries, the RBMK design could become unstable under certain conditions, like a usually calm horse that might become skittish if not handled just right. The test was supposed to begin with the reactor operating at about 25% power, a comfortable, manageable level where the atomic conversations would be gentle and easy to control. But as the operators began reducing power, something unexpected happened. The reactor's power dropped much lower than intended, falling to just 1% of its normal output. This put the reactor in an unusual state, like trying to have a whispered conversation in a vast, echoing hall where everyone had to strain to hear each other. The neutron population became unstable, and the control systems began behaving in ways the operators hadn't anticipated. The operators, dedicated professionals who had worked with nuclear reactors for years, tried their best to bring the reactor back to the proper power level for the test. They began withdrawing control rods to increase the neutron activity, but the reactor remained sluggish and unpredictable. It was as if they were trying to encourage a tired fire to burn brighter, but the fire was behaving strangely, sometimes flickering and sometimes flaring unexpectedly. The xenon gas that naturally builds up in reactor cores was affecting the neutron balance in ways that made the reactor increasingly difficult to control. As the test finally began, the operators disconnected some automatic safety systems, not out of recklessness, but because the test procedure required it. In normal circumstances, this would have been perfectly safe. But the reactor was now in a delicate state that required all of its protective systems to be working together. It was like removing the training wheels from a bicycle, just as the rider was learning to navigate a particularly tricky path. The reactor's power began to rise rapidly, much faster than anyone expected. Within seconds, the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. The reactor's power surged too many times its normal level, and the fuel rods began to overheat dramatically. The water that normally cooled the reactor turned to steam so quickly that it couldn't carry away the heat effectively. The pressure built up like water boiling in a sealed pot, and the reactor began to tear itself apart from the inside. The massive concrete and steel lid of the reactor, weighing hundreds of tons, was lifted and displaced by the force of the steam and expanding gases. The explosion that followed wasn't like a bomb going off, but rather like a giant, ancient pressure cooker finally releasing all its pent-up energy at once. The graphite blocks that had helped moderate the neutron dance began to burn, sending radioactive particles high into the night sky on clouds of smoke and steam. The reactor core, which had been safely contained for years, was now open to the atmosphere, releasing its radioactive contents into the wind like seeds from a dandelion, but seeds that carried the invisible energy of split atoms. The first responders arrived, thinking they were dealing with a conventional fire at the power plant. These brave firefighters and plant workers couldn't see or smell the radiation, but they could see the flames and knew that people needed help. They worked through the night, not fully understanding that they were walking into one of the most radioactive environments ever created on Earth. Their courage and dedication saved many lives, even as they unknowingly exposed themselves to dangerous levels of radiation that would affect their health for years to come. In the hours following the accident, as radioactive particles drifted silently through the spring night air, an extraordinary group of people began to emerge from the darkness. They would later become known as the liquidators, a name that sounds harsh but really means those who cleaned up, and they represented some of the most selfless heroism in human history. These weren't soldiers or superheroes, but ordinary people, plant workers, firefighters, miners, soldiers, and volunteers who understood that someone had to step forward to protect their families, their communities, and their world from the invisible danger that had been released. The first heroes were the plant operators and emergency workers who stayed at their posts, even as radiation levels soared to unimaginable heights. They knew the reactor better than anyone, and they understood that certain critical systems still needed attention to prevent an even worse disaster. These men walked through areas where the radiation was so intense that their bodies were receiving in minutes what most people might safely absorb over many years. They manually operated valves, monitored systems, and maintained essential functions. Knowing full well the personal cost of their actions, their quiet dedication prevented the accident from becoming even more catastrophic. The firefighters who arrived that night faced flames unlike any they had encountered before. The graphite blocks from the reactor core were burning with an intense, persistent fire that seemed to resist their usual methods. But these weren't ordinary flames. They were radioactive, sending contaminated smoke and particles into the air with every gust of wind. The firefighters couldn't see the radiation, but they could see the fire, and their training told them that fires must be fought. They climbed onto the roof of the reactor building, carrying hoses and equipment, working methodically to extinguish the blaze while unknowingly walking through some of the most radioactive debris on Earth. As dawn broke and the true scope of the accident became clear, the evacuation of nearby Pripyat began with remarkable calm and organization. Families were told they were leaving temporarily, just for a few days while the situation was resolved. Parents packed light bags for their children, expecting to return home soon. The buses that carried 50,000 people away from their homes were filled not with panic, but with the quiet resilience of communities that had learned to trust their neighbors and help each other through difficult times. Children pressed to their faces to windows, watching their familiar streets disappear, not knowing they were seeing their childhood homes for the last time. The liquidators who arrived in the following days and weeks came from all across the Soviet Union. They were miners who dug tunnels beneath the reactor to install cooling systems, helicopter pilots who flew through radioactive clouds to drop sand and concrete onto the exposed reactor core, and construction workers who built the massive concrete sarcophagus that would eventually entomb the damaged reactor. Many were volunteers who understood the gravity of the situation and chose to help despite the risks. Others were assigned to the task, but carried it out with dedication and professionalism that transformed duty into heroism. The cleanup efforts required incredible ingenuity and courage. Remote-controlled robots were sent in to clear radioactive debris, but the intense radiation damaged their electronic circuits, forcing human workers to take over tasks that machines couldn't complete. These workers, wearing heavy protective suits and carrying radiation detectors, worked in carefully timed shifts, sometimes for just minutes at a time, to limit their exposure. They called themselves biorobots, with grim humor, acknowledging that they were doing work that even the best technology couldn't accomplish. The pilots who flew helicopters over the reactors showed extraordinary skill and bravery. They dropped thousands of tons of sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the exposed reactor core, flying through clouds of radioactive dust that coated their aircraft and penetrated their cabins. Each flight was carefully planned to minimize exposure time, but the pilots knew that with every mission, they were absorbing radiation that would stay with them for life. Yet they continued, flight after flight, until the reactor was sealed and the immediate danger reduced. Perhaps most remarkably, the international scientific community rallied to provide expertise and support. Nuclear experts from around the world shared their knowledge freely, offering advice on containment strategies, medical treatment for radiation exposure, and long-term monitoring plans. The accident had occurred in one country, but the response became a global effort, demonstrating how shared knowledge and cooperation could help humanity face even the most challenging technological disasters. The immediate aftermath of Chernobyl revealed something beautiful about human nature when faced with invisible danger that threatened not just themselves, but future generations. Thousands of people chose to act with courage, selflessness, and quiet determination. They became the guardians who stood between a nuclear accident and a much worse catastrophe, proving that even in our darkest technological moments, human decency and bravery can shine through. In the months and years that followed Chernobyl, something remarkable and quietly hopeful began to unfold across the affected regions. The radiation that had been released into the environment started its long, patient journey of decay, following the same natural laws that govern all atomic processes. Radioactive materials are like clocks that tick at their own predetermined pace. Some release their energy quickly and fade away in days or weeks, while others take decades or centuries to return to peaceful stability. This invisible process of healing has been happening continuously since the accident, as nature follows its ancient patterns of renewal and recovery. The human body, it turns out, is wonderfully resilient when it comes to radiation exposure. While high doses can certainly cause harm, our cells have evolved over millions of years to cope with the naturally radioactive environment of Earth. The people who lived in the affected areas after Chernobyl have been carefully monitored by medical researchers, and the results have been both sobering and surprisingly hopeful. Children born in the years following the accident have grown up healthy and strong, their bodies naturally processing and eliminating most radioactive materials they might have encountered. The human immune system and cellular repair mechanisms work tirelessly to heal radiation damage, often successfully restoring normal function over time. One of the most unexpected discoveries has been the remarkable recovery of wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Without human activity to disturb them, animals have returned in numbers that exceed pre-accident populations. Wolves roam through abandoned villages, bears fish in pristine streams, and rare birds nest in the ruins of evacuated homes. These animals live in an environment that is still slightly radioactive, yet they appear to be thriving. While they do carry some radiation in their bodies, their populations are healthy and growing, suggesting that nature has an extraordinary capacity to adapt and flourish even in challenging circumstances. The forests around Chernobyl have become unintentional laboratories for studying how ecosystems respond to radiation. Trees that absorbed radioactive particles in their rings now tell the story of the accident's immediate impact, followed by decades of gradual healing. New growth shows steadily decreasing levels of contamination as the trees draw nutrients from soil that becomes cleaner each year. The forest floor, once covered with highly radioactive leaves and debris, has been slowly processed by countless microorganisms that break down organic matter and help distribute and dilute radioactive materials throughout the ecosystem. Scientists who study the long-term effects of Chernobyl have made discoveries that extend far beyond radiation exposure. They've learned about the incredible resilience of natural systems, the importance of biodiversity in ecosystem recovery, and the complex ways that human absence can allow nature to reclaim and restore damaged environments. The exclusion zone has become an accidental wildlife preserve, demonstrating how quickly nature can bounce back when given the opportunity to heal without human interference. The people who lived through Chernobyl have shown their own forms of resilience and adaptation. Many evacuees rebuilt their lives in new communities, maintaining their cultural traditions and family bonds. Despite the upheaval, some elderly residents returned to their homes in the exclusion zone, choosing to live out their remaining years in familiar surroundings despite the slight increase in radiation exposure. Their choice reflects a deep human understanding that the psychological benefits of home and community can outweigh abstract statistical risks. Medical research following Chernobyl has led to significant advances in understanding and treating radiation exposure. Doctors have developed better protocols for managing radiation sickness, more effective medications for protecting the thyroid gland, and improved screening methods for detecting radiation-related health problems early. The knowledge gained from studying Chernobyl's health impacts has made nuclear medicine safer and more effective for millions of patients worldwide who benefit from radioactive treatments for cancer and other diseases. The environmental monitoring systems established after Chernobyl have created an unprecedented database of information about how radioactive contamination behaves in real-world conditions. This knowledge has improved nuclear safety protocols, enhanced emergency response procedures, and provided valuable insights for managing any future nuclear incidents. The accident became an unintended teacher, offering lessons that have made nuclear technology safer around the world. Perhaps most importantly, the long-term recovery from Chernobyl has demonstrated that even serious nuclear accidents are not permanent catastrophes. While the immediate impacts were severe and the human cost was real, the patient processes of natural decay, biological adaptation, and ecosystem recovery have been steadily healing the affected areas. The exclusion zone, once seen as a dead wasteland, has become a testament to nature's remarkable ability to reclaim and restore damaged environments. This gentle healing continues every day as radioactive elements slowly transform into stable forms and life finds new ways to flourish in spaces that humans temporarily abandoned. On the morning of March 11, 2011, the coastline of Japan was experiencing one of those perfectly ordinary spring days that make you grateful to be alive. Families were starting their weekend routines, children were playing in schoolyards, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was operating quietly along the peaceful Pacific shore, its 6 reactors humming with the gentle rhythm of controlled atomic energy. The plant had been serving the region faithfully for over 40 years, providing clean electricity to millions of homes while nestled between the mountains and the sea in a landscape of extraordinary natural beauty, but deep beneath the ocean floor, about 130 kilometers from the coast. The Earth was preparing to remind humanity of the immense forces that shape our planet. The Pacific tectonic plate had been slowly sliding beneath the North American plate for millions of years, building up enormous pressure like a giant spring being compressed deeper and deeper. At 2:46 in the afternoon, this geological tension finally reached its breaking point, and the seafloor suddenly shifted with such tremendous force that it moved the entire island of Japan about 8 feet closer to North America and tilted the Earth's axis by several inches. This was no ordinary earthquake. With a magnitude of 9.0, it was one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, releasing energy equivalent to millions of atomic bombs. But earthquakes are simply Earth's way of adjusting and settling, like a sleeper shifting positions to find comfort. The nuclear power plant, designed to withstand even major earthquakes, responded exactly as its engineers had planned. Automatic systems detected the violent shaking within seconds and immediately began shutting down the 3 reactors that were operating at the time, inserting control rods to stop the atomic reactions as safely and quickly as possible. The earthquake itself, despite its incredible power, didn't damage the nuclear reactors significantly. The robust engineering and careful safety planning proved their worth as the massive structures rode out the violent shaking with remarkable resilience. Emergency diesel generators automatically started up to provide power for cooling systems, and for those first crucial minutes, everything seemed to be proceeding according to the emergency protocols that had been practiced countless times. The plant operators, trained professionals who had dedicated their careers to nuclear safety, began implementing well-rehearsed procedures for managing a post-earthquake shutdown. But the earthquake was only the beginning of nature's lesson. That day, the sudden movement of the seafloor had displaced enormous volumes of ocean water, creating waves that began racing across the Pacific at the speed of a jet airplane. These tsunami waves are different from ordinary ocean waves. They're more like horizontal floods that carry the entire depth of the ocean with them. As they approached the Japanese coast, the shallow water compressed these waves upward, transforming them from fast-moving ripples in the deep ocean into towering walls of water that rose 40 feet high in some places. The Fukushima plant had been built with seawalls designed to protect against tsunamis, but this wave was higher than anyone had anticipated. The water poured over the barriers like a gentle giant stepping over a garden fence, flooding the lower levels of the reactor buildings where crucial electrical equipment was housed. In a matter of minutes, the backup diesel generators that had been running faithfully since the earthquake were overwhelmed by seawater and shut down. The plant was left without the electrical power needed to run the cooling pumps that keep reactor cores at safe temperatures. This is where the story becomes particularly poignant, because nuclear reactors don't simply turn off like light switches. Even after the chain reaction stops, the fuel continues to generate significant heat from the natural decay of radioactive elements, like embers that continue glowing long after a fire has been extinguished. This decay heat must be continuously removed by circulating cooling water, or the fuel temperature will gradually rise until it begins to damage the reactor core without power to run the cooling pumps. The plant operators found themselves in an unprecedented situation, watching helplessly as temperatures in 3 reactor cores began to climb. The tsunami had also devastated the surrounding communities, washing away entire towns and cutting communication lines. The plant operators couldn't even call for help initially, as they worked by flashlight and battery-powered radios to understand their situation and implement whatever emergency measures they could manage. They opened valves manually to release steam pressure, used fire trucks to pump seawater into reactors, and worked around the clock with a dedication that reflected their deep sense of responsibility to protect their neighbors and their nation from further harm. What unfolded at Fukushima wasn't a sudden catastrophic explosion like Chernobyl, but rather a slow, agonizing loss of control as heat and pressure gradually overwhelmed the containment systems. It was like watching a carefully tended garden slowly succumb to drought, despite every effort to save it. In the hours after the tsunami overwhelmed Fukushima's defenses, a small group of about 50 workers made a decision that would define their legacy forever. While most personnel were evacuated to safety, these dedicated individuals chose to stay behind at the crippled nuclear plant, knowing full well the risks they faced. The media would later call them the Fukushima 50, though the actual number fluctuated as different specialists rotated in and out of the danger zone. These weren't action heroes from a movie, but ordinary engineers, technicians, and operators who understood that someone had to remain to prevent an even worse disaster from unfolding. The plant manager, Masao Yoshida, became the quiet leader of this unprecedented emergency response. Working from a darkened emergency command center, lit only by battery-powered lights, he coordinated efforts to cool the overheating reactors using whatever resources remained available. The normal cooling systems had failed, the backup generators were flooded, and even the instrument panels that showed reactor conditions were dark. It was like trying to tend to 3 very sick patients in a hospital during a blackout, with only a flashlight and basic medical supplies, while aftershocks continued to shake the building and radioactive steam occasionally vented from the reactors above. The decision to use seawater to cool the reactors was both desperate and brilliant. Nuclear reactors are normally cooled with carefully purified water, and introducing salt water meant that the reactors would never operate again. The salt would corrode and damage equipment beyond repair. But Yoshida and his team understood that saving the reactors was far less important than preventing a complete meltdown that could release much more radioactive material into the environment. Fire trucks were brought as close as possible to the reactor buildings, and their pumps were used to inject millions of gallons of Pacific Ocean water directly into the reactor cores. It was like using garden hoses to fight a forest fire, but it was the only option they had. The work was incredibly dangerous and physically demanding. Workers had to venture into highly radioactive areas to manually operate valves, check equipment, and lay hoses for the seawater injection systems. They worked in shifts measured not by hours but by radiation exposure limits, sometimes staying in contaminated areas for only minutes at a time before rotating out to allow their bodies time to recover. Many wore full-face respirators and protective suits that made the already difficult work even more exhausting in the humid conditions of the damaged plant. The helicopter pilots, who flew missions over the reactors, showed remarkable courage and skill. They dropped tons of water onto the damaged reactor buildings from above, flying through clouds of radioactive steam while trying to aim precisely at the reactor pools that contained spent nuclear fuel. Each flight exposed the crew to significant radiation, and the helicopters themselves became contaminated with radioactive particles. Yet the pilots continued their missions, understanding that the spent fuel pools needed water to prevent an even more serious release of radioactive material. The international response to Fukushima demonstrated the global nuclear community's commitment to helping during crisis. The United States immediately dispatched nuclear experts and specialized equipment, including robots designed to work in high radiation environments. France sent radiation monitoring equipment and protective gear. The International Atomic Energy Agency coordinated technical assistance and shared real-time information with nuclear safety experts worldwide. It was a reminder that nuclear technology, despite being developed by individual nations, ultimately belongs to all humanity and requires collective wisdom to manage safely. The local communities surrounding Fukushima showed extraordinary resilience and cooperation during the evacuation process. Unlike the sudden, chaotic evacuations sometimes portrayed in disaster movies, the Japanese evacuation was methodical and orderly. Families helped neighbors, especially elderly residents who needed assistance. Evacuation centers were organized and supplied through the coordinated efforts of local governments, relief organizations, and volunteers who worked tirelessly to ensure that displaced families had food, shelter, and medical care. The Japanese self-defense forces played a crucial role in both the nuclear response and the broader tsunami relief efforts. They established exclusion zones around the plant, assisted with evacuations, and provided logistical support for the emergency response operations. Their disciplined, systematic approach helped maintain order during an incredibly chaotic and frightening time, allowing the technical experts to focus on the nuclear emergency, while knowing that the surrounding areas were being managed safely. Perhaps most remarkably, the crisis brought out the best in Japanese society's culture of collective responsibility and mutual support. The concept of gamen enduring hardship with patience and dignity became visible in countless small acts of heroism and cooperation. Workers at the plant continued their duties despite personal fears. Families shared resources in evacuation centers, and entire communities pulled together to support the emergency response efforts. The response to Fukushima became not just a technical achievement in nuclear crisis management, but a testament to human dignity under the most challenging circumstances. On a quiet Wednesday morning in March 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station in Pennsylvania was humming along peacefully near the banks of the Susquehanna River. The plant's second reactor had been operating for just 3 months, still in that careful phase when new nuclear facilities are monitored with extra attention, like a new home being lived in for the first time. The operators on duty that morning were experienced professionals who had worked with nuclear reactors for years, and everything seemed perfectly normal as they went through their routine monitoring procedures in the early hours before dawn. But sometimes the most significant events begin with the smallest problems, like a single loose thread that gradually unravels an entire sweater. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a valve in the plant's secondary cooling system malfunctioned, not in the nuclear part of the reactor, but in the conventional steam and water system that carries heat away from the reactor core. This was the kind of minor equipment failure that happens occasionally in any complex industrial facility, and the reactor's safety systems responded exactly as they were designed to do. Automatic systems immediately shut down the reactor and began emergency cooling procedures. To keep the reactor core safely cooled, What happened next illustrates both the incredible sophistication of nuclear safety systems and the sometimes confusing complexity of managing them during unusual situations. A pressure relief valve opened to release excess steam from the reactor, which was exactly what it was supposed to do. But then, instead of closing again, as it should have, the valve stuck open, creating a pathway for cooling water to escape from the reactor system. This was like having a bathtub with a drain that wouldn't close. Water was flowing out faster than it was being replaced. Even though the system was designed to keep the reactor core covered with cooling water at all times, the control room operators couldn't see the stuck valve directly. They had to interpret what was happening inside the reactor, based on the readings from dozens of instruments and gauges. In the dim lighting of the control room, with alarms sounding and warning lights flashing, they faced a puzzle that would challenge even the most experienced nuclear engineers. The instruments seemed to be giving contradictory information. Some indicated that the reactor had plenty of cooling water, while others suggested that water levels were dropping. It was like trying to diagnose a patient's illness when the thermometer and blood pressure cuff were giving conflicting readings. The operators made decisions based on their training and the information available to them. But the situation was unlike anything they had practiced in their emergency drills. They actually turned off some of the emergency cooling pumps because the instruments seemed to indicate that the reactor had too much water rather than too little. In reality, the reactor core was gradually becoming uncovered as cooling water continued to escape through the stuck valve. For several hours, portions of the uranium fuel became hot enough to suffer damage, though the reactor's thick steel pressure vessel and concrete containment building continued to hold everything safely inside. As morning progressed and more experts arrived at the plant, the true nature of the problem gradually became clear. The reactor core had been partially uncovered and damaged, but the fundamental safety barriers were holding. The containment building was doing its job, keeping radioactive materials inside where they belonged. A small amount of radioactive gas was deliberately released to reduce pressure in the containment, but this release was carefully controlled and represented only a tiny fraction of the reactor's radioactive inventory. The accident became a media sensation partly because it occurred during a time when the public was already questioning nuclear power, and partly because the initial information released by the utility company and government agencies was confusing and sometimes contradictory. The movie, The China Syndrome, about a fictional nuclear accident, had been released just 12 days before the 3 Mile Island incident, creating an eerie sense that life was imitating art. Television news crews camped outside the plant for days, reporting on every development as engineers worked methodically to bring the reactor to a safe, stable condition. The most tense moment came when engineers detected hydrogen gas inside the containment building and worried that it might explode. For a brief time, officials considered recommending evacuation of a much larger area around the plant. Fortunately, further analysis showed that the hydrogen was not dangerous, but the uncertainty created several days of anxiety for residents and officials alike. Pregnant women and young children within 5 miles of the plant were advised to evacuate as a precautionary measure, creating images of worried families leaving their homes that became symbolic of nuclear fears. Deep in the Ural Mountains of Russia, far from the eyes of the world, lay a secret city that didn't appear on any maps. In 1957, this place was known only by its code name, Chelyabinsk 40, and it housed one of the Soviet Union's most important nuclear facilities, the Mayak Production Association. Here, in a landscape of birch forests and quiet lakes, scientists and workers were engaged in the urgent task of producing plutonium for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. The facility was so secret that even the people who worked there used code names for their city, and their families often didn't know exactly what kind of work brought them to this remote location in the heart of Russia's industrial heartland. The Mayak facility had been operating since the late 1940s, processing spent nuclear fuel from reactors and separating the valuable plutonium from the radioactive waste products. This was incredibly complex and dangerous work, performed in an era when the full health effects of radiation exposure weren't completely understood. The urgency of the Cold War meant that safety sometimes took second place to production quotas, and the environmental consequences of nuclear waste disposal weren't given the careful consideration they would receive today. Liquid radioactive waste was stored in large underground tanks, like buried containers holding the most dangerous byproducts of the atomic age. On September 29, 1957, one of these storage tanks containing about 70 tons of high-level radioactive waste began to overheat. The tank held a mixture of radioactive chemicals that had been accumulating heat from radioactive decay for years, like a slow-cooking stew that gradually became hotter and more unstable over time. The cooling system for this particular tank had failed some time earlier, but in the pressure to maintain production schedules, repairs had been delayed. Without proper cooling, the waste mixture slowly heated up until it reached a critical temperature where chemical reactions could no longer be controlled. The explosion that followed wasn't the dramatic atomic fireball that many people imagine when they think of nuclear accidents. Instead, it was more like a massive pressure cooker finally giving way, sending radioactive materials high into the autumn sky in a cloud of dust and debris. The force of the explosion was equivalent to several tons of conventional explosives, enough to scatter contaminated material across hundreds of square miles of the beautiful Ural countryside. The radioactive cloud drifted with the wind, settling on forests, farms, and small villages like invisible snow that would remain dangerous for decades. The immediate response to the accident revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet system during this period. Local authorities moved quickly to evacuate the most affected areas, relocating over 10,000 people from their homes within days of the explosion. Entire villages were abandoned almost overnight, with residents told they could not take their livestock or belongings. The evacuations were carried out efficiently but with little explanation to the affected families, who were simply told they needed to move for their safety without being given details about what had happened or when they might return home. What made the Kyshtym accident particularly significant was not just its scale, but the decades of secrecy that followed. The Soviet government classified all information about the incident, and for more than 20 years, the outside world had no idea that such a serious nuclear accident had occurred. Local residents were told that the evacuation was due to a disease outbreak among animals, and the contaminated area was quietly designated as a nature reserve to prevent people from returning. The Tekia River, which had been contaminated by radioactive runoff from the facility for years before the explosion, continued to flow through downstream communities where people had no idea their water supply had been affected. The environmental consequences of the Kyshtym accident unfolded slowly and quietly over the following decades. The contaminated zone, which became known as the East Urals radioactive trace, stretched for hundreds of kilometers downwind from the explosion sites. Pine forests in the most heavily affected areas died and were replaced by birch trees, which proved more resistant to radiation. Wildlife populations initially declined but gradually recovered, though with genetic changes that scientists would study for decades. The soil in contaminated areas slowly concentrated radioactive materials in patterns that helped researchers understand how nuclear contamination moves through natural ecosystems. The secrecy surrounding Kyshtym began to lift only in the late 1970s, when a Soviet scientist named Georges Medvedev, living in exile in Britain, published detailed accounts of the accident based on scientific papers and his own knowledge of the Soviet nuclear program. Even then, many Western experts initially dismissed his reports as exaggerated or fabricated. It wasn't until the glasnost period of the 1980s that the Soviet government finally acknowledged the accident and began sharing information about its environmental and health consequences with international researchers. In the gentle countryside of Cumbria, England, where rolling green hills meet the Irish Sea, stands a nuclear facility that has witnessed some of Britain's most important lessons in atomic energy. In October 1957, the Windscale nuclear reactors were humming quietly beside the peaceful village of Seascale, their tall concrete chimneys rising like industrial lighthouses against the misty English sky. These reactors were part of Britain's ambitious post-war nuclear program, designed to produce plutonium for the nation's nuclear weapons, while also advancing the peaceful applications of atomic energy. The facility represented British engineering pride and the country's determination to join the exclusive club of nuclear powers in the uncertain world of the 1950s. The Windscale reactors were unique in their design, using natural uranium fuel and graphite blocks to moderate the nuclear reactions, with air flowing through the core to carry away heat. This air-cooled design was simpler than water-cooled reactors but required careful management to maintain proper temperatures throughout the graphite core. On October 7, 1957, operators began a routine procedure called a Wigner release, which involved heating the reactor to remove energy that had been slowly building up in the graphite structure over months of operation. This was like periodically warming up a car engine that had been sitting idle, allowing accumulated stress to dissipate harmlessly. But something went wrong during this seemingly routine procedure. The temperature in part of the reactor core began rising higher than expected, reaching levels where the uranium fuel itself started to overheat. In one section of the reactor, the metal cladding around the uranium fuel began to melt, and then the uranium itself caught fire. Nuclear fuel burning inside a reactor creates an extraordinarily dangerous situation, as it can release radioactive materials directly into the cooling air that flows through the reactor and out into the atmosphere. It was like having a fire start in the chimney of a house, where the smoke would carry dangerous materials directly outside. The reactor operators found themselves facing a fire that couldn't be fought with conventional methods. Water couldn't be used initially because there was concern that it might react with the hot graphite and uranium, potentially making the situation worse. Instead, they tried to smother the fire by increasing the flow of carbon dioxide through the reactor, hoping to starve the flames of oxygen. For 2 days, the fire continued to burn while engineers debated the best course of action. The reactor's tall chimney stack, equipped with filters designed to catch radioactive particles, was releasing a steady stream of contaminated air into the peaceful Cumbrian countryside. The decision to finally use water to extinguish the fire was both brave and risky. There was genuine concern that introducing water to the intensely hot reactor core might cause a steam explosion or create hydrogen gas that could ignite. But as the fire continued and radioactive releases increased, the reactor manager made the difficult decision to flood the reactor with water from the site's fire brigade. Firefighters connected their hoses to the reactor's cooling system and began pumping thousands of gallons of water directly onto the burning fuel. Miraculously, the water successfully cooled the reactor without causing the feared explosion, and the fire was finally extinguished after burning for 3 days. The immediate environmental impact of the Windscale fire was most visible in the surrounding dairy farms, where cows grazed peacefully on grass that had been dusted with radioactive fallout. Government inspectors quickly began testing milk from farms across the region, finding elevated levels of radioactive iodine that could be dangerous, particularly for children whose growing thyroid glands are especially sensitive to this type of contamination. In a decision that would cost millions of pounds but protect public health, authorities ordered that milk from over 500 square kilometers of farmland be collected and disposed of rather than consumed. For several weeks, the quiet country roads of Cumbria were busy with tanker trucks collecting milk that would be poured into the sea rather than delivered to homes and schools. The Windscale fire taught British nuclear engineers important lessons about reactor safety and emergency response. The incident led to significant improvements in reactor design, better fire detection and suppression systems, and enhanced training for reactor operators. The filters in the Windscale chimney, which had initially been considered unnecessary by some engineers, proved their worth by capturing a significant portion of the radioactive material that would otherwise have spread much further across the countryside. This accident helped establish the principle that nuclear facilities should be designed with multiple safety systems, even for problems that seem unlikely to occur. The response to Windscale also demonstrated the importance of honest, transparent communication with the public about nuclear accidents. While the British government initially tried to minimize the seriousness of the incident, the visible impact on local farming communities made it impossible to hide the consequences completely. The eventual acknowledgement of the accident's severity helped build public trust in nuclear safety authorities and established precedents for how future nuclear incidents would be communicated to affected communities. In the high desert of Idaho, where endless sagebrush stretches toward distant mountains under vast winter skies, stood a small experimental nuclear reactor that would teach the nuclear world one of its most profound and tragic lessons. The SL-1, or Stationary Low Power Reactor No. 1, was nestled in the remote Idaho National Testing Station, far from any towns or cities, in a landscape of quiet desolation, where nuclear engineers could safely test new reactor designs. This wasn't a power plant meant to generate electricity for homes, but rather a prototype reactor designed to provide heat and power for remote military installations, perhaps in the Arctic or other isolated locations where conventional power sources weren't practical. On the cold evening of January 3, 1961, three young men were working alone in the small reactor building, performing routine maintenance that should have been as ordinary as any other day's work. Richard Legg was 26, John Burns was 27, and Richard McKinley was 22. All trained nuclear technicians who had worked with reactors before and understood the careful procedures required for safe operation. They were preparing the reactor to restart after a holiday shutdown, reassembling control rod mechanisms that had been partially disassembled for maintenance. It was quiet, methodical work in the small reactor building, lit by artificial lights, against the early winter darkness of the Idaho desert. The SL-1 reactor was designed differently from large power reactors, with manual control rods that could be moved by hand rather than by electric motors. This made the reactor simpler and more suitable for remote locations where sophisticated control systems might be difficult to maintain. But it also meant that the reactor's nuclear chain reaction was controlled by the physical position of just a few control rods, and moving them required careful attention and precise technique. The reactor had been shut down for the holidays, and bringing it back to operational status required the operators to manually adjust these control rods to achieve the proper nuclear balance. What happened next occurred so quickly that investigators would spend months reconstructing the precise sequence of events. One of the control rods needed to be lifted by just a few inches to prepare the reactor for a startup, but somehow it was withdrawn much farther than intended, perhaps as much as 20 inches beyond its normal operating position. In a reactor as small as the SL-1, removing a control rod that far was like suddenly opening all the windows in a carefully heated room. Except that instead of letting in cold air, it allowed the nuclear chain reaction to accelerate far beyond any safe level. The nuclear reaction became supercritical in a fraction of a second, releasing enormous amounts of energy in a space no larger than a telephone booth. The rapid heating of the reactor core created a steam explosion that lifted the entire reactor vessel into the air, along with all the associated piping and equipment. The force was so sudden and violent that it drove control rods upward like spears, and the three operators in the small reactor building were killed instantly. It was a tragedy that happened faster than human reflexes could respond in a reactor so small that the entire core contained less nuclear material than a single fuel assembly in a large power reactor. The rescue efforts that followed demonstrated both the dangers of working with nuclear materials and the extraordinary dedication of emergency responders. When the first rescuers arrived at the reactor building, their radiation detectors immediately warned them that the environment was intensely radioactive. The explosion had scattered radioactive debris throughout the small building, and the reactor core itself was partially destroyed and exposed. Rescue workers had to approach the building in short shifts, wearing full protective equipment and working against time limits measured in minutes rather than hours. The investigation into the SL-1 accident revealed important lessons about reactor design and human factors in nuclear safety. The reactor's design made it possible for a single operator error to cause a catastrophic accident, something that modern reactor designs are specifically engineered to prevent. Current nuclear reactors have multiple, independent safety systems, and are designed so that no single human action can cause a serious accident. The control systems are designed with built-in limits that prevent control rods from being moved too far too quickly, and multiple operators must coordinate their actions during critical procedures. The SL-1 accident also highlighted the importance of proper training and procedures for nuclear operations. The investigation found that the specific sequence of actions that led to the accident wasn't covered adequately in the operator's training, and the procedures for reactor startup didn't include sufficient safeguards against rapid control rod movement. This led to significant improvements in nuclear training programs and the development of more detailed step-by-step procedures that leave less room for misinterpretation or error. Perhaps most importantly, the SL-1 accident taught nuclear engineers that even small reactors demand the same respect and careful attention as large ones. The fundamental physics of nuclear chain reactions doesn't change based on reactor size, and the potential consequences of losing control of atomic energy are always serious, regardless of scale. In the warm, bustling city of Goiânia, Brazil, where tropical breezes carry the sounds of daily life through tree-lined streets, an abandoned medical clinic held a secret that would soon transform an ordinary September day in 1987 into one of the most unusual nuclear accidents in history. the clinic had been relocating to a new facility, leaving behind medical equipment. That included a teletherapy machine used for cancer treatment. This machine contained a small capsule of cesium-137, a radioactive material that had spent years helping to heal cancer patients by precisely targeting tumors with controlled radiation, but now forgotten and unguarded in the empty clinic. This healing technology was about to become a source of unintended danger to local scrap metal dealers. Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Pereira discovered the abandoned clinic and noticed the teletherapy machine. To them, it looked like valuable scrap metal that could be sold to recycling dealers. They had no way of knowing that deep inside the machine's lead-lined housing was a small stainless steel capsule containing cesium chloride powder that glowed with an eerie blue-green light. This glow wasn't the result of electricity or chemical reactions, but rather the visible evidence of radioactive decay, atoms of cesium spontaneously transforming and releasing energy that made the surrounding air itself emit light. After several days of work with simple tools, the two men managed to puncture the protective capsule and discovered the mysterious glowing powder inside. The beauty of the light was mesmerizing. It seemed almost magical, like something from a fairy tale or science fiction movie. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most dangerous radioactive sources outside of a nuclear reactor, containing about 1,375 curies of radioactivity, enough to power a radiotherapy machine for years of cancer treatments. To them, it was simply a fascinating curiosity that glowed in the dark without any apparent power source. The men brought their discovery to Daver Alves Ferreira, who operated a junkyard in the city. Daver was equally fascinated by the glowing material and broke open the capsule further, distributing small amounts of the beautiful blue powder to friends and family members. Children rubbed the powder on their skin like luminous body paint, delighting in how it made them glow in the dark. Families shared small amounts with neighbors, and the mysterious substance spread through several households as people marveled at its otherworldly beauty. Nobody understood that each gram of this powder was intensely radioactive, far more dangerous than the materials found in nuclear power plants. The first signs that something was wrong appeared gradually over the following days and weeks. People who had handled the cesium began developing symptoms that seemed like a strange flu: nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and skin irritation. Daver's wife, Gabriela, was among the first to suspect that the glowing powder might be causing the illnesses. She carefully collected the remaining material in a plastic bag and carried it to the local hospital, where she tried to convince doctors that the beautiful substance was making people sick. Her intuition and determination saved countless lives, as she prevented the powder from spreading to even more families in the community. Dr. Paulo Roberto Montero, at the hospital, initially dismissed Gabriela's concerns, but something about the glowing material troubled him enough to contact the local nuclear authorities. When specialists arrived with radiation detection equipment, their instruments immediately confirmed the worst fears. The powder was intensely radioactive, and everyone who had been exposed needed immediate medical attention. The hospital itself had become contaminated when Gabriela brought the material inside, requiring careful decontamination procedures to protect patients and staff. The medical response to the Goiânia accident became a model for treating radiation exposure in civilian populations. Over 100,000 people were monitored for radiation exposure, though most had received only minimal doses. About 250 people were found to have significant contamination, and 20 required hospitalization for radiation sickness. The medical teams used a drug called Prussian blue to help remove cesium from patients' bodies, and they carefully monitored everyone for years afterward to watch for long-term health effects. The dedication of doctors and nurses who worked around the clock to care for radiation victims demonstrated the same quiet heroism seen in other nuclear accidents. The cleanup of Goiânia required removing contaminated soil, demolishing several houses, and carefully disposing of everything that had come into contact with the sea. Entire neighborhoods had to be evacuated while teams in protective suits used sensitive instruments to locate every trace of radioactive contamination. Personal belongings, furniture, and even pets had to be tested for radioactivity. The cleanup generated thousands of cubic meters of radioactive waste that required secure storage, creating a lasting reminder of how quickly radioactive materials can spread through a community when proper controls are absent. The Goiânia accident led to significant improvements in the regulation and tracking of radioactive medical sources worldwide. Countries strengthened their systems for monitoring medical equipment, ensuring that radioactive sources are never abandoned or improperly disposed of. There's something beautifully human about our relationship with complex technology, and nuclear power is perhaps the most complex technology we've ever created. When we look at all the nuclear accidents we've explored together tonight, a gentle pattern emerges, not one of technological failure, but of human beings doing their best to manage systems that sometimes behave in unexpected ways. We are naturally curious creatures, always reaching out to understand and control the world around us, but we are also wonderfully imperfect, prone to the small mistakes and oversights that make us human. In the quiet spaces between what we know and what we think we know, accidents find their way into our carefully planned world. The operators at Chernobyl weren't reckless or incompetent. They were experienced professionals trying to complete a safety test using procedures that seemed reasonable at the time. The workers at 3 Mile Island weren't ignoring their training. They were interpreting confusing instrument readings and making decisions based on their understanding of how nuclear reactors should behave. The young men at SL1 weren't being careless. They were following what they believed to be proper maintenance procedures. In each case, human beings were trying to do the right thing, but the complexity of nuclear systems created situations where good intentions met unforeseen circumstances. Nuclear power plants are like vast orchestras with thousands of instruments that must play in perfect harmony. Every pump, valve, gauge, and control rod has a role to play in the gentle symphony of controlled atomic energy. The operators are like conductors, trying to keep this orchestra playing beautiful music, but they can't see every musician directly. They must interpret the sound and trust that each section is following the score. Sometimes a single instrument begins playing a slightly different tune, and if the conductor doesn't notice quickly enough, the discord can spread through the entire orchestra until the music becomes chaotic and discordant. Human communication plays a crucial role in nuclear safety, just as it does in every other aspect of our lives. During accidents, we've seen how small misunderstandings can grow into larger problems, like whispers in a children's game of telephone, where the message becomes distorted as it passes from person to person. At 3 Mile Island, the operators thought they understood what their instruments were telling them, but the instruments were telling a story that was more complex than anyone had anticipated. At Chernobyl, there were communication breakdowns between different levels of authority, where critical safety information didn't reach the people who needed it most. Stress and fatigue affect human judgment in ways that are particularly important in nuclear operations. Working with nuclear technology requires constant attention to detail, careful adherence to procedures, and the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. But nuclear plant operators are human beings who get tired, who worry about their families, who sometimes have bad days, just like everyone else. During emergencies, when adrenaline is flowing and time pressure is intense, even the most experienced professionals can make decisions that seem obvious in hindsight, but were genuinely difficult at the moment. The culture within nuclear organizations also influences how accidents develop and how they're resolved. In some cases, there's been too much emphasis on meeting production schedules and not enough on questioning unusual conditions or reporting concerns. Workers might hesitate to speak up about problems if they fear being blamed or criticized. On the other hand, the best nuclear organizations create environments where every person feels responsible for safety and comfortable raising questions or concerns, no matter how minor they might seem. Training and procedures are human attempts to capture wisdom and pass it on to others, but they're necessarily imperfect tools. Nuclear procedures are written by people who try to anticipate every possible situation. But the real world has an infinite capacity to present scenarios that weren't covered in the training manual. Simulators help operators practice emergency responses, but simulated emergencies are necessarily simplified versions of the complex, chaotic situations that can develop during real accidents. The gap between training and reality is where human judgment becomes most important and most vulnerable. Perhaps most importantly, the human element in nuclear accidents reminds us that perfectibility isn't achievable, but continuous improvement is. Every accident has led to better training, improved procedures, more robust designs, and clearer communication protocols. The nuclear industry has learned to embrace what's called a safety culture, an approach that assumes human error is inevitable and designs systems to catch and correct mistakes before they become serious problems. Modern nuclear plants have multiple independent safety systems, specifically because engineers understand that humans, no matter how well trained and dedicated, will occasionally make errors. The most touching aspect of nuclear accidents is how they reveal human nature at its best and worst simultaneously. We see the mistakes and oversights that led to problems, but we also see extraordinary courage, dedication, and sacrifice as people work to protect their communities from harm. The liquidators at Chernobyl, the Fukushima 50, the firefighters at Windscale, all chose to face dangerous situations because they understood their responsibility to others. This duality is essentially human. We create problems through our imperfections, and we solve them through our capacity for growth, learning, and selfless action. Radiation is perhaps the most misunderstood companion in our daily lives, surrounding us as constantly and naturally as the air we breathe, yet remaining completely invisible to our senses. Right now, as you rest comfortably listening to this gentle story, cosmic rays from distant stars are passing through your body. Radioactive elements in the earth beneath your home are slowly releasing energy, and even the potassium in the banana you might have eaten for breakfast is quietly undergoing radioactive decay. This invisible presence isn't something to fear, but rather to understand as part of the natural fabric of our universe, as fundamental as gravity or magnetism, and as ancient as the stars themselves. Think of radiation as nature's way of allowing unstable atoms to find peace and balance. When atoms have too much energy stored in their cores, they gradually release that excess energy in the form of radiation, transforming themselves into more stable, comfortable configurations. It's like a person carrying a heavy backpack who occasionally needs to set it down and rest. The radiation is simply the atom's way of shedding burden and finding equilibrium. This process has been happening since the beginning of time, powering the stars, warming the earth from within, and even contributing to the evolution of life by providing a gentle source of genetic variation. Our bodies are wonderfully equipped to deal with the natural radiation that surrounds us constantly. We've evolved over millions of years in a radioactive environment, and our cells have developed sophisticated repair mechanisms that can fix most radiation damage before it causes any harm. It's like having a team of tiny maintenance workers constantly going through your body, checking for problems and making repairs with remarkable efficiency. These cellular repair systems work on radiation damage the same way they work on damage from sunlight, chemical exposure, or simply the natural wear and tear of living and growing. The background radiation that exists everywhere on Earth comes from cosmic rays that shower down from space, radioactive elements naturally present in soil and rocks, and radioactive isotopes that are naturally part of our bodies. This background radiation varies from place to place. People living in Denver receive more cosmic radiation because of the higher altitude, while people living near granite formations experience slightly higher radiation from naturally radioactive uranium in the rock. Yet these natural variations are simply part of the diverse environment our planet provides, like differences in temperature, humidity, or air pressure. When we measure radiation, we use units that might sound scientific and intimidating, but they're really just ways of counting the tiny bursts of energy that radioactive atoms release. A Geiger counter clicks each time it detects a radioactive decay event, like counting raindrops falling on a roof during a gentle shower. The faster the clicking, the more radioactive atoms are present in the area. But even in the most radioactive places on Earth, these individual decay events are happening at the atomic level, so small that trillions of them could occur without affecting a single cell in your body. The different types of radiation have different characteristics, like members of a family with distinct personalities. Alpha radiation consists of relatively large particles that can't even penetrate a sheet of paper or the outer layer of your skin. Beta radiation is more energetic but can be stopped by a thin sheet of aluminum or plastic. Gamma radiation is the most penetrating, like very high-energy light that can pass through many materials, but even gamma rays can be blocked by sufficient shielding. Understanding these differences helps explain why some radioactive materials are more dangerous than others and why different types of protection are needed in different situations. Medical uses of radiation demonstrate how this invisible force can be harnessed for healing rather than harm. X-rays allow doctors to see inside our bodies without surgery. Nuclear medicine can target cancer cells with precision, and radioactive tracers help physicians understand how different organs are functioning. In each case, the radiation dose is carefully calculated to provide maximum benefit while minimizing any risk. It's like using a very sharp knife for surgery, potentially dangerous if misused, but incredibly beneficial when applied with skill and wisdom. The key to understanding radiation safety lies in three simple principles: time, distance, and shielding. The less time you spend near a radioactive source, the lower your exposure. The farther you are from the source, the less radiation reaches you. It follows the same inverse square law as light or sound, becoming much weaker with distance, and shielding with appropriate materials can block radiation entirely. These principles are so fundamental that they apply whether you're protecting yourself from natural sunlight or artificial radiation sources. Perhaps most importantly, radiation exposure from nuclear accidents, while serious, needs to be understood in the context of the radiation we encounter naturally throughout our lives. The human body's ability to repair radiation damage, combined with the protective measures that can be taken during and after nuclear accidents, means that even significant radiation exposure doesn't necessarily lead to immediate or long-term health problems. Understanding radiation as a natural phenomenon that can be measured, predicted, and controlled helps transform fear into informed caution and wise decision-making. There's something profoundly heartbreaking about the moment when home transforms from a place of comfort and belonging into a place that must be left behind. The evacuation zones around nuclear accidents represent one of humanity's most difficult decisions, asking entire communities to abandon the places where they've built their lives, raised their children, and created countless precious memories. The invisible nature of radiation makes these evacuations particularly poignant, because the homes and landscapes often look exactly the same as they did before the accident. Yet something fundamental has changed in ways that can't be seen or touched. The creation of evacuation zones follows careful scientific calculations about radiation levels and health risks. But the human impact extends far beyond any mathematical formula. When authorities draw circles on maps around damaged nuclear facilities, they're creating invisible borders that separate families from their histories, farmers from their land, and communities from their shared identity. These zones typically start with immediate evacuations from the most affected areas, then expand in careful stages as scientists better understand how radioactive materials have spread through the environment. It's like watching ripples spread across a pond, except these ripples represent displacement and loss, rather than simple movement of water. The evacuation of Pripyat, near Chernobyl, has become the most famous example of how communities respond to nuclear displacement. Families were told they were leaving temporarily, just for a few days, while the situation was resolved. So many people packed only light bags with immediate necessities. Children grabbed favorite toys, parents collected important documents, and families locked their doors expecting to return soon. The buses that carried 50,000 people away from their homes were filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope, worry about the unknown situation, but confidence that they would soon be back in their familiar surroundings. That temporary departure has now lasted nearly 4 decades, transforming Pripyat into one of the world's most famous ghost towns. The gradual understanding that evacuation might be permanent creates a unique form of grief that's different from other types of loss. Unlike natural disasters that destroy homes through visible forces like fire or flood, nuclear evacuations preserve the physical structures while making them temporarily uninhabitable. Families can sometimes return to visit their former homes, finding everything exactly as they left it but knowing they can't stay. It's like being able to visit a loved one who's sleeping but can never wake up. The form remains, but the essence of home has been suspended in time. Nature's response to human evacuation zones has provided some of the most surprising and hopeful stories to emerge from nuclear accidents. In the absence of human activity, wildlife populations have flourished in ways that scientists never anticipated. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has become an accidental wildlife preserve where wolves, bears, lynx, and countless bird species thrive in numbers that exceed pre-accident populations. Wild horses roam through abandoned villages, deer graze in former schoolyards, and rare birds nest in the ruins of human habitation. The radiation that made these areas uninhabitable for humans has proven less problematic for many animal species, demonstrating nature's remarkable capacity for adaptation and recovery. The return process for evacuated areas involves incredibly careful monitoring and gradual restoration of human habitation. Scientists continuously measure radiation levels in soil, water, air, and food products, watching for the slow decrease that occurs as radioactive materials naturally decay over time. Some areas become safe for resettlement relatively quickly, while others require decades or longer before radiation levels drop to acceptable limits. The decision about when to allow people to return involves balancing scientific data about radiation exposure with human factors like economic needs, cultural connections, and individual choice about acceptable risk. Many former residents, particularly elderly people, have chosen to return to evacuation zones despite official recommendations to stay away. These returnees, sometimes called self-settlers, make deeply personal decisions that their connection to their homeland outweighs the statistical risks of radiation exposure. They tend their gardens, maintain their homes, and preserve the cultural traditions of their communities even in the absence of most neighbors. Their presence keeps these areas from becoming completely abandoned, maintaining a human connection to places that might otherwise be lost to history. The psychological impact of evacuation extends far beyond the immediate displacement, affecting entire generations of families who must rebuild their sense of place and belonging in new locations. Children who were evacuated carry memories of homes they can't return to, while parents struggle with guilt about exposing their families to radiation and grief about losing their communities. Yet these same families often demonstrate remarkable resilience, creating new traditions, building new social networks, and finding ways to honor their heritage while adapting to new circumstances. The evacuation zones around nuclear accidents have become unintentional laboratories for studying how human communities and natural ecosystems respond to sudden, dramatic change. They teach us about the deep connections between people and place, the importance of community in human well-being, and nature's capacity for recovery and renewal. Most importantly, they remind us that behind every circle drawn on an emergency map are thousands of individual stories of loss, adaptation, courage, and hope. The medical response to nuclear accidents reveals some of the most touching stories of human compassion and scientific dedication. As doctors and nurses work to heal wounds that can't be seen or touched, radiation sickness is unlike any other medical condition because it affects the body at the most fundamental level, the cells themselves, yet the damage unfolds slowly and quietly, often without immediate symptoms. When the first radiation victims from Chernobyl arrived at hospitals in Moscow, many looked and felt perfectly normal, but their bodies had absorbed invisible energy that would gradually affect their immune systems, blood cells, and ability to heal from ordinary injuries. Dr. Robert Peter Gale, an American bone marrow specialist, became one of the heroes of Chernobyl when he traveled to the Soviet Union to help treat the most severely affected patients. Working alongside Soviet physicians, he brought advanced techniques for bone marrow transplantation that offered hope for people whose bodies could no longer produce healthy blood cells. The international cooperation that developed around treating Chernobyl victims demonstrated how medical knowledge transcends political boundaries. Doctors from different countries shared their expertise freely, united by their commitment to healing rather than divided by the Cold War tensions of the time. The treatment of acute radiation syndrome requires a delicate balance between supporting the body's natural healing processes and protecting patients from infections that their damaged immune systems can't fight off. Radiation affects rapidly dividing cells most severely, which means that bone marrow, the digestive tract, and hair follicles are particularly vulnerable. Patients often lose their hair and experience severe nausea, but these visible symptoms are actually signs that the body is trying to repair itself. Medical teams create sterile environments where patients can recover while their bone marrow slowly regenerates new blood cells, a process that can take weeks or months. One of the most important medical lessons from nuclear accidents has been the development of treatments that help the body eliminate radioactive materials more quickly. Potassium iodide tablets, distributed to people near nuclear accidents, flood the thyroid gland with stable iodine so it can't absorb radioactive iodine from the environment. Prussian blue, used in the Gojania accident, helps the digestive system eliminate cesium before it can be fully absorbed into the body. These treatments work like gentle detox programs, helping the body's natural elimination processes. work more efficiently to remove unwanted radioactive materials. The psychological care of radiation exposure victims requires special sensitivity and understanding. Unlike other injuries where patients can see their wounds healing, radiation exposure creates anxiety about invisible damage that might affect health for years to come. Many people develop what's called radiophobia, an intense fear of radiation that can be more debilitating than the actual radiation exposure. Medical teams have learned to provide not just physical treatment but also careful counseling and education to help patients understand their actual health risks and cope with the uncertainty that radiation exposure creates. Children require special protection and care during nuclear accidents because their growing bodies are more sensitive to radiation and they have longer lifespans over which health effects might develop. The medical response to nuclear accidents always prioritizes children for evacuation, monitoring, and treatment. Pediatric specialists work carefully to explain radiation exposure to young patients in age-appropriate ways, helping families understand how to protect their children, while avoiding unnecessary fear and anxiety that could affect the entire family's well-being. The long-term medical monitoring that follows nuclear accidents has created some of the world's largest and most comprehensive health studies. Thousands of people affected by Chernobyl, Fukushima, and other nuclear incidents participate in regular health screenings that track their well-being over decades. These studies have provided invaluable information about the long-term effects of radiation exposure, helping doctors better understand how to treat future radiation victims and how to counsel people about their health risks. Surprisingly, many of these studies have found that radiation exposure, while serious, often has less severe long-term health impacts than originally feared. The development of radiation medicine as a medical specialty has been directly influenced by lessons learned from nuclear accidents. Emergency physicians now train specifically in radiation exposure treatment, and hospitals near nuclear facilities maintain special protocols and equipment for treating radiation victims. Medical schools teach courses in radiation health, and research continues into new treatments for radiation exposure. The knowledge gained from treating accident victims has also improved cancer treatments that use radiation, making these therapies safer and more effective for millions of patients worldwide. Perhaps most remarkably, the medical response to nuclear accidents has demonstrated the human body's extraordinary capacity for healing from radiation damage. While high doses of radiation can certainly cause serious health problems, the majority of people exposed to radiation from nuclear accidents recover completely with appropriate medical care. The cellular repair mechanisms that protect us from natural background radiation work tirelessly to fix radiation damage, often restoring normal health even after significant exposure. This resilience gives hope and comfort to anyone who might face radiation exposure, knowing that dedicated medical professionals have effective treatments and that the human body has remarkable powers of recovery. Nature possesses an extraordinary capacity for healing that often surprises even the most experienced environmental scientists, and nowhere is this more beautifully demonstrated than in the gradual recovery of areas affected by nuclear accidents. In the forests around Chernobyl, the contaminated soil that once seemed permanently damaged has become a living laboratory where we can observe the patient, methodical ways that natural systems restore themselves over time. The radioactive particles that fell like invisible snow in 1986 have slowly been absorbed, diluted, and transformed by countless natural processes working together in harmony. Like a vast ecosystem orchestra playing a slow, restorative symphony, the soil itself acts as nature's most important filter and protector, binding radioactive materials to clay particles and organic matter in ways that prevent them from easily moving through the environment. Rain and groundwater gradually carry some contamination deeper into the earth, where it becomes less accessible to plants and animals living on the surface. Microorganisms in the soil, bacteria, fungi, and countless tiny creatures invisible to the naked eye work continuously to break down organic matter and cycle nutrients, slowly processing and transforming radioactive materials in the same patient way they've been recycling nutrients for millions of years. Trees in contaminated forests tell fascinating stories through their growth rings, recording year by year how they've adapted to their radioactive environment. In the first years after Chernobyl, some tree rings show slower growth as plants adjusted to their changed conditions. But gradually, the rings returned to normal thickness as the trees learned to thrive despite the presence of radioactive materials in their environment. Pine trees, which proved more sensitive to radiation, were gradually replaced by birch forests that showed greater resilience, demonstrating nature's ability to select the species best suited for survival in changing conditions. The wildlife that returned to exclusion zones has provided some of the most hopeful evidence of environmental recovery. Wolves, bears, elk, and wild boar now roam through areas where humans once lived, creating thriving ecosystems with predator-prey relationships that mirror what existed before the nuclear accidents. These animals do carry radioactive materials in their bodies, but their populations are healthy and growing, suggesting that the biological impact of low-level radiation exposure is less severe than many scientists initially feared. Birds migrate freely in and out of contaminated areas, and fish swim in rivers that flow through exclusion zones, all continuing their ancient patterns of life and reproduction. The process of environmental remediation, human efforts to help nature heal more quickly, has taught us valuable lessons about working with natural processes rather than against them. In some areas, contaminated topsoil has been carefully removed and replaced with clean earth, while in others, scientists have experimented with phytoremediation, using plants that naturally absorb radioactive materials to gradually clean the soil. Sunflowers, for example, have remarkable ability to take up radioactive metals through their roots, concentrating these materials in their flowers and leaves where they can be harvested and disposed of safely. The water systems flowing through contaminated areas demonstrate nature's powerful capacity for self-purification. Rivers and streams gradually dilute radioactive materials as they flow toward the sea, while wetlands and floodplains act as natural filters that trap contaminated sediments. Fish populations in these waters initially showed elevated levels of radioactive materials, but monitoring over decades has shown steady decreases as the contamination is gradually flushed from the watershed and diluted in larger bodies of water. Agricultural recovery in affected areas follows careful patterns of testing, remediation, and gradual return to production. Farmers have learned techniques for reducing the uptake of radioactive materials by crops. Adding potassium to soil reduces cesium absorption by plants, while adjusting soil pH can limit the availability of radioactive metals. Some crops, like berries and mushrooms, tend to concentrate radioactive materials more than others, so agricultural recovery involves careful selection of crops and ongoing monitoring to ensure food safety. The seasonal cycles that have continued uninterrupted in contaminated areas provide beautiful evidence of nature's persistence and resilience. Spring still brings new growth and returning birds. Summer still sees forests in full bloom. Autumn still produces harvests of nuts and berries that feed wildlife through winter. And winter still blankets the landscape in snow that melts and flows toward the sea. These eternal rhythms continue regardless of human industrial accidents, demonstrating that life has a momentum and persistence that transcends temporary disruptions. Climate change has added an interesting dimension to environmental recovery from nuclear accidents, as changing weather patterns affect how radioactive materials move through ecosystems. Increased rainfall can accelerate the washing of contamination from forest floors, while changing temperatures affect the growth rates of different plant species. These interactions between nuclear contamination and climate change provide insights into how ecosystems respond to multiple environmental stressors simultaneously. The most profound lesson from environmental recovery around nuclear accidents is that nature operates on timescales much longer than human planning horizons. While we think in terms of years or decades, natural systems think in terms of centuries and millennia. The radiation that seems permanently damaging to human perspectives represents only a temporary perturbation to ecosystems that have survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and countless other disruptions over millions of years of Earth's history. When nuclear accidents occur, something beautiful happens that transcends the political boundaries and cultural differences that often divide our world. The invisible nature of radiation, which doesn't respect borders or nationalities, calls forth a response that reveals the best of human nature, our capacity to work together when faced with challenges that affect all of humanity. The international cooperation that emerges during nuclear emergencies demonstrates how shared knowledge and mutual concern can unite countries that might otherwise be suspicious of each other. creating temporary families of nations working toward the common goal of protecting people and healing the environment. The response to Chernobyl provided one of the most remarkable examples of Cold War enemies becoming collaborative partners in the face of nuclear crisis. When the Soviet Union initially tried to handle the accident alone, radioactive clouds drifting across European borders made it clear that nuclear accidents are inherently international problems. Within days, scientists from Western countries were sharing data about radiation measurements, meteorologists were collaborating on tracking the spread of contamination, and medical experts were offering their knowledge about treating radiation exposure. The Iron Curtain that divided East and West became permeable when it came to nuclear safety, as experts on both sides recognized that atomic energy required collective wisdom rather than competitive secrecy. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which was created to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy, transformed during nuclear accidents into a coordinating center for global emergency response. Their experts travel to accident sites within hours, bringing specialized equipment, technical expertise, and most importantly, the accumulated knowledge of the entire international nuclear community. When Fukushima was struggling with multiple reactor failures, IAEA teams worked alongside Japanese experts, sharing real-time information with nuclear safety authorities around the world so that everyone could learn from the evolving situation and offer relevant assistance. Medical cooperation during nuclear accidents reveals the fundamental unity of human concern for healing and health. After Chernobyl, American bone marrow specialists worked in Soviet hospitals. French radiation medicine experts shared treatment protocols, and doctors from many countries contributed to caring for the most severely affected patients. The Japanese medical response to Fukushima benefited from decades of international research into radiation health effects, while Japanese expertise in managing large-scale disasters was shared with international colleagues who might face similar challenges. In the future, medical knowledge flows freely across borders during nuclear emergencies because doctors everywhere recognize their shared commitment to preserving life and reducing suffering. The sharing of technological resources during nuclear accidents demonstrates how quickly nations can mobilize assistance when faced with urgent need. Specialized robots designed to work in high radiation environments, advanced radiation monitoring equipment, and protective gear for emergency workers move rapidly from country to country during nuclear crises. When Soviet helicopters couldn't safely approach the Chernobyl reactor, Western nations offered remote-controlled aircraft and specialized instruments. When Japanese power companies needed massive pumps to inject cooling water into Fukushima reactors, equipment arrived from around the world within days, along with teams of experts who knew how to operate it effectively. Scientific cooperation extends far beyond the immediate emergency response, creating lasting partnerships that improve nuclear safety for everyone. The data collected during nuclear accidents becomes part of a shared global database that helps engineers design safer reactors, emergency responders develop better procedures, and medical professionals understand how to treat radiation exposure more effectively. Research papers about nuclear accidents are published collaboratively by scientists from many countries, ensuring that the lessons learned from each incident benefit the entire international community rather than remaining isolated within national boundaries. The cultural exchange that occurs during international nuclear cooperation often leads to lasting friendships and professional relationships that persist long after the immediate crisis has passed. Engineers who work together during emergency responses continue collaborating on safety improvements. Doctors who treated radiation victims together share ongoing research about long-term health effects. And environmental scientists who studied contamination patterns together continue monitoring recovery processes for decades. These personal connections create networks of trust and communication that make future cooperation more effective and immediate. International nuclear cooperation also involves the peaceful sharing of resources for monitoring and research. Countries contribute funding for long-term studies of accident effects, share satellite data for tracking contamination patterns, and coordinate environmental monitoring programs that provide comprehensive pictures of how radioactive materials move through global ecosystems. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Monitoring Network, originally designed to detect nuclear weapons tests, has been adapted to provide early warning about nuclear accidents, creating a global safety net that benefits all nations regardless of whether they operate nuclear facilities. Perhaps most importantly, international cooperation during nuclear accidents helps establish and strengthen the norms and expectations that govern nuclear safety worldwide. When countries work together to respond to nuclear emergencies, they implicitly agree that nuclear technology carries responsibilities that extend beyond national borders. This cooperation creates pressure for higher safety standards, more transparent reporting of nuclear incidents, and better preparation for emergency response. The shared experience of managing nuclear accidents together builds confidence that the international community can handle nuclear challenges cooperatively rather than competitively, making nuclear technology safer for everyone through collective vigilance and mutual support. That every nuclear accident has become an unintended teacher, offering lessons that engineers and scientists have carefully studied and translated into safer reactor designs and improved safety systems. The beautiful thing about human nature is our capacity to learn from mistakes and use that knowledge to protect future generations, transforming painful experiences into wisdom that makes technology more reliable and forgiving. When nuclear engineers examine the wreckage of damaged reactors or study the sequence of events that led to accidents, they're not just investigating failures, they're discovering opportunities to create systems that are more robust, more intuitive for operators to understand, and more capable of protecting themselves even when multiple things go wrong simultaneously. The reactor designs that emerged after 3 Mile Island incorporated what engineers call passive safety systems, protective mechanisms that work automatically without requiring human intervention or electrical power. These systems use the fundamental forces of physics, gravity, natural circulation of water, and pressure differences to ensure that reactors can cool themselves safely even during complete power outages or equipment failures. It's like designing a building that naturally protects itself from fire, rather than relying solely on sprinkler systems that might fail. Modern reactors have containment vessels that can withstand much greater pressures, cooling systems that work even when pumps fail, and control rooms with clearer, more intuitive displays that help operators understand what's happening inside the reactor. The lessons from Chernobyl led to fundamental changes in reactor design philosophy, particularly the elimination of reactor types that could become unstable under certain operating conditions. The RBMK reactor design used at Chernobyl had characteristics that made it difficult to control during some unusual situations, like a car that might suddenly accelerate when the driver expects it to slow down. Modern reactor designs are inherently stable, meaning they naturally shut themselves down if conditions become abnormal, rather than requiring constant human supervision to prevent runaway reactions. These new designs are like gentle horses that naturally slow down when they sense danger, rather than spirited stallions that might bolt if startled. Advanced computer systems now monitor reactor conditions continuously with the precision and speed that human operators could never achieve alone. These systems can track thousands of measurements simultaneously, comparing current conditions to vast databases of normal operations and quickly identifying even subtle deviations that might indicate developing problems. The computers don't replace human judgment, but they provide operators with much better information for making decisions, like having an experienced co-pilot who never gets tired, never gets distracted, and can process information faster than any human. When something unusual happens, these systems can immediately suggest appropriate responses and even implement some protective actions automatically. The control room designs in modern nuclear plants reflect decades of learning about human factors and how people interact with complex technology during stressful situations. Instead of walls covered with hundreds of individual gauges and switches that could overwhelm operators during emergencies, modern control rooms use computer displays that present information in logical, intuitive ways. The most important information is always prominently displayed, while detailed data is available when needed but doesn't clutter the operator's view during normal operations. It's like the difference between an old airplane cockpit filled with mechanical gauges and a modern aircraft with clear, organized electronic displays that help pilots focus on what matters most. Training for nuclear plant operators has evolved dramatically based on lessons learned from accidents, with much greater emphasis on understanding the underlying physics of reactor behavior rather than simply memorizing procedures. Operators now spend extensive time in sophisticated simulators that can recreate not just normal operating conditions but also the complex, confusing situations that develop during accidents. These simulators can reproduce the exact conditions that existed at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima, allowing operators to practice managing these scenarios until their responses become instinctive and confident. It's like learning to drive by practicing not just on sunny days with good roads, but also in rain, snow, and other challenging conditions. Emergency response capabilities have been strengthened through portable equipment that can be rapidly deployed to nuclear plants during severe accidents. These systems include diesel generators that can power essential equipment, pumps that can inject cooling water into reactors, and communication systems that work even when normal infrastructure is damaged. The idea is to ensure that nuclear plants always have backup options for their backup options, creating multiple layers of protection that can prevent small problems from growing into larger ones. International cooperation has accelerated the pace of nuclear safety improvements by ensuring that lessons learned in one country quickly benefit nuclear operators worldwide. When engineers in France develop a new safety system, or when Japanese operators discover a better emergency procedure, this knowledge spreads rapidly through international networks of nuclear professionals. Modern reactor designs incorporate the best safety features developed in many different countries, creating a global standard of nuclear safety that continuously improves as more experience is gained. The most profound improvement in nuclear technology has been the development of what engineers call defense in depth. The principle that nuclear safety should never depend on any single system or human action working perfectly. Modern nuclear plants have multiple independent safety systems, each capable of protecting the public even if all other systems fail. This approach recognizes that technology and humans are imperfect, but that multiple imperfect systems working together can achieve very high levels of reliability and safety. There's something deeply human about our complex relationship with nuclear technology, a mixture of wonder and worry that reflects our natural caution about forces we can't see or fully control. When nuclear accidents occur, they ripple through public consciousness in ways that extend far beyond the immediate physical effects, creating waves of concern that spread across continents and persist for generations. The invisible nature of radiation makes nuclear accidents particularly frightening because our senses, which evolved to protect us from dangers we can see, hear, or smell, offer no warning about radioactive contamination. This creates a unique form of anxiety where the imagination often fills the gaps left by our inability to directly perceive the danger. The way nuclear accidents are reported in the media significantly shapes how the public understands and responds to these events. Television news, with its need for dramatic visuals and simplified explanations, often focuses on the most frightening aspects of nuclear accidents while struggling to convey the complex, gradual nature of radiation effects. The explosion at Chernobyl created compelling footage of damaged buildings and emergency responses, but the cameras couldn't show the invisible radiation that was the real concern. This visual limitation sometimes leads to misunderstandings where the dramatic images become more memorable than the scientific explanations of actual health risks. That the timing of nuclear accidents in relation to popular culture has also influenced public perception in fascinating ways. The 3 Mile Island accident occurred just days after the release of The China Syndrome, a movie about a fictional nuclear accident, creating an eerie sense that reality was imitating art. This coincidence amplified public anxiety because people had just seen dramatized versions of nuclear disasters on movie screens, making the real accidents seem like confirmation of their worst fears. The power of storytelling to shape perception means that fictional portrayals of nuclear accidents often become more influential than dry scientific reports about actual risks and safety measures. Public education about nuclear technology faces the challenge of explaining complex scientific concepts to audiences with varying levels of scientific background. Radiation exposure is measured in units like sieverts and becquerels that mean nothing to most people, while the health effects are described in statistical terms that can be difficult to translate into personal risk assessment. Telling someone they have a slightly increased statistical risk of cancer doesn't provide the concrete, actionable information that people naturally want when trying to protect their families. This communication gap often leaves room for fear and speculation to fill the spaces where clear, accessible information should be. The generational differences in nuclear perception reflect the different historical contexts in which people formed their opinions about atomic energy. Older generations who lived through the Cold War and nuclear weapons testing often associate nuclear technology with existential threats and military applications, while younger people may be more concerned about climate change and view nuclear power as a potential solution to carbon emissions rather than primarily as a source of danger. These different perspectives create ongoing debates about nuclear policy that reflect broader cultural values about technology, risk, and environmental protection. The communities that live near nuclear facilities often develop more nuanced and practical attitudes toward nuclear technology than the general public. People who work at nuclear plants, have neighbors employed in the nuclear industry, or have lived near nuclear facilities for decades, tend to have more detailed knowledge about actual nuclear operations and safety measures. Their familiarity with the day-to-day reality of nuclear technology often makes them more supportive of nuclear power than people who encounter it only through news reports about accidents. This suggests that direct experience and ongoing education can help people develop more balanced perspectives about nuclear risks and benefits. The psychological phenomenon of dread risk helps explain why nuclear accidents create such intense public concern even when the actual health effects may be limited. Dread risks are those that seem uncontrollable, unfamiliar, potentially catastrophic, and likely to affect future generations. Nuclear accidents score high on all these psychological factors, making them particularly frightening even when statistical analysis suggests that other technologies or activities pose greater actual dangers to public health. A coal plant that releases more radiation through its emissions than a nuclear plant releases during normal operations doesn't trigger the same psychological response because coal seems familiar and controllable. The role of trusted messengers in shaping public opinion about nuclear technology cannot be overstated. When people receive information about nuclear risks from sources they trust, whether that's their family doctor, a respected local official, or a trusted news anchor, they're more likely to accept that information than when it comes from sources they view with suspicion. This means that effective nuclear communication requires building relationships with community leaders, healthcare providers, and other trusted voices, rather than simply issuing technical statements from government agencies or nuclear industry organizations. Perhaps most importantly, public perception of nuclear technology continues to evolve as people gain more experience with nuclear accidents and their aftermath. The initial panic and evacuation from areas around nuclear accidents is often followed by years of careful study that provide more precise information about actual health effects. This longer timeline allows communities to develop more mature, informed perspectives about nuclear risks based on observed outcomes rather than initial fears and speculation. That, as we look toward the future of nuclear technology, there's a quiet sense of hope emerging from the lessons learned through decades of both successes and setbacks. The nuclear engineers and scientists working today carry with them the accumulated wisdom of every accident, every safety improvement, and every technological breakthrough that has come before. They're designing reactors that learned from the past, while embracing new technologies that make nuclear power safer, cleaner, and more intuitive for human operators to manage. These new reactor designs represent not just technological advancement, but a maturation of our relationship with atomic energy, moving from the bold experimentation of the early nuclear age toward the patient, methodical development of truly safe and sustainable nuclear systems. The small modular reactors being developed around the world represent a fundamental shift in nuclear design philosophy, emphasizing simplicity and inherent safety over the massive, complex systems of traditional nuclear plants. These smaller reactors are designed to be factory-built and transported to their operating sites, ensuring consistent quality control and reducing the complexity of on-site construction that has sometimes led to delays and cost overruns. More importantly, their smaller size means that, even if everything goes wrong, the potential consequences are inherently limited, like the difference between a small campfire that might get out of control versus a massive bonfire that could threaten an entire forest. Advanced reactor designs incorporate what engineers call walk-away safe technology. meaning that operators could literally walk away from the reactor during an emergency and it would safely shut itself down without any human intervention or external power sources. These designs use the laws of physics, gravity, natural circulation, and thermal expansion to ensure safety rather than relying on complex engineered systems that might fail during emergencies. It's like designing a sailboat that naturally turns into the wind when released, using natural forces to maintain stability, rather than requiring constant human control to prevent capsizing. The integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning into nuclear safety systems offers exciting possibilities for preventing accidents before they develop. These advanced computer systems can analyze patterns in reactor behavior that human operators might not notice, identifying subtle changes that could indicate developing problems days or weeks before they become serious. The AI doesn't replace human judgment but enhances it, like having an incredibly observant assistant who never gets tired and can remember every detail of how the reactor has behaved over its entire operating history. When combined with human expertise and intuition, these systems create a level of safety monitoring that surpasses anything available in earlier generations of nuclear technology. International cooperation in nuclear safety continues to strengthen, creating global networks of shared knowledge and mutual support that make nuclear technology safer everywhere. New reactors benefit from the collective experience of the entire international nuclear community, incorporating safety features and operational procedures that have been tested and refined. In many different countries and cultures, the International Atomic Energy Agency coordinates safety standards that apply worldwide, ensuring that a reactor built in one country meets the same rigorous safety requirements as reactors built anywhere else. This global approach means that nuclear safety improvements developed anywhere in the world quickly benefit nuclear operators everywhere. The next generation of nuclear architecture engineers brings fresh perspectives and new approaches to nuclear safety, unencumbered by some of the assumptions and practices that may have contributed to past accidents. These young professionals have grown up with advanced computer technology, sophisticated simulation tools, and a deep understanding of human factors in complex systems. They approach nuclear design with both respect for the lessons of the past and excitement about the possibilities for improvement, creating a culture that values both innovation and careful attention to safety. Fusion power represents the ultimate, long-term goal for nuclear technology, harnessing the same process that powers the sun to create clean energy without the long-lived radioactive waste associated with current fission reactors. While fusion power plants are still decades away from commercial operation, the research and development efforts underway around the world are making steady progress toward this revolutionary energy source. Fusion reactions require such specific conditions to sustain themselves that they naturally shut down if anything goes wrong, making fusion inherently safer than fission and eliminating many of the safety concerns associated with current nuclear technology. The evolving relationship between nuclear power and renewable energy sources like solar and wind creates opportunities for nuclear technology to play a complementary role in clean energy systems. Advanced nuclear reactors are being designed with the flexibility to adjust their power output to match the variable nature of renewable energy, providing stable baseload power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. This partnership between nuclear and renewable energy could provide the reliable, carbon-free electricity needed to address climate change, while maintaining the energy security that modern societies require. Perhaps most importantly, the future of nuclear safety depends on maintaining the culture of continuous learning and improvement that has developed over decades of nuclear experience. Each new reactor design, each operational improvement, and each safety enhancement builds upon the foundation of knowledge created by everyone who has worked to make nuclear technology safer. This ongoing commitment to learning from both successes and failures ensures that nuclear technology will continue becoming safer, more reliable, and more beneficial for humanity's energy needs. Nuclear technology has quietly woven itself into the fabric of modern life in ways that extend far beyond the electricity flowing through our homes and the dramatic accidents that capture headlines. In hospitals around the world, nuclear medicine helps millions of people each year fight cancer, diagnose heart conditions, and treat thyroid disorders with a precision and effectiveness that would have seemed miraculous just generations ago. The same radioactive materials that can be dangerous in nuclear accidents become gentle healers when carefully controlled and applied by skilled medical professionals. A cancer patient receiving targeted radiation therapy is benefiting from the same fundamental atomic forces that power nuclear reactors, but channeled toward healing rather than electricity generation. The communities that have grown up around nuclear facilities over the past 70 years demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity to adapt and thrive alongside powerful technology. Towns like Richland, Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, were literally built around nuclear facilities, and their residents have developed a practical, informed relationship with atomic energy that balances respect for its power with confidence in safety systems and procedures. Children in these communities often grow up with parents who work in nuclear facilities, learning from an early age that nuclear technology, when properly managed, can be as safe and routine as any other sophisticated industrial process. Nuclear technology supports space exploration in ways that enable some of humanity's most inspiring achievements. The radioisotope thermoelectric generators that power spacecraft like Voyager and Curiosity use the heat from naturally decaying plutonium to generate electricity for decades-long missions to the outer planets. These nuclear power sources allow us to explore regions of the solar system where solar panels would be ineffective, carrying human knowledge and curiosity to places where the sun appears as just another distant star. The same nuclear processes that once seemed purely destructive have become tools for expanding human understanding of our place in the cosmos. Agricultural applications of nuclear technology help feed the growing global population through techniques that improve crop yields and food safety. Nuclear irradiation can eliminate harmful bacteria from food without using chemical preservatives, extending shelf life and reducing foodborne illness. Plant breeding programs use controlled radiation to create genetic variations that lead to more nutritious crops, disease-resistant varieties, and plants that can thrive in challenging climates. These peaceful applications of nuclear technology demonstrate how atomic energy can contribute to human welfare in subtle but important ways that rarely make news headlines. That the carbon-free electricity generated by nuclear power plants has quietly prevented billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions over the decades, making nuclear energy one of humanity's most effective tools for addressing climate change. A single large nuclear plant can provide as much clean electricity as hundreds of wind turbines or thousands of acres of solar panels, occupying a relatively small footprint while operating reliably, regardless of weather conditions. Countries with significant nuclear power programs, like France and Sweden, have achieved some of the lowest carbon emissions per capita in the developed world, demonstrating how nuclear technology can be integrated into modern energy systems. Alongside renewable sources, the international treaties and agreements that govern nuclear technology have created a framework for peaceful cooperation that extends beyond energy into areas like nuclear medicine, scientific research, and nonprofit efforts. The same international organizations that monitor nuclear safety also coordinate the sharing of medical isotopes for cancer treatment, support research into new nuclear technologies, and work to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. This global governance system represents one of humanity's most successful examples of managing powerful technology through international cooperation and shared responsibility. Living safely with nuclear technology requires maintaining what nuclear professionals call a safety culture, a mindset that assumes accidents are possible and designs systems to prevent them, rather than simply hoping they won't occur. This culture extends from the engineers who design reactors to the operators who run them, the regulators who oversee them, and the communities that host them. It involves constant questioning of assumptions, regular testing of safety systems, and honest communication about problems and improvements. This approach to managing technological risk has applications far beyond nuclear technology, offering lessons for how societies can safely develop and deploy other powerful technologies. The next generation of nuclear workers brings diverse perspectives and fresh approaches to nuclear technology, including more women and people from varied cultural backgrounds than earlier generations of nuclear professionals. This diversity strengthens nuclear safety by bringing different viewpoints and problem-solving approaches to the challenges of managing atomic energy. Young nuclear engineers often combine deep technical knowledge with strong environmental awareness, seeing nuclear technology as part of the solution to climate change rather than simply as a source of cheap electricity. Perhaps most importantly, living with nuclear technology peacefully requires ongoing education and dialogue between nuclear professionals and the broader public. This conversation must acknowledge both the benefits and risks of nuclear technology while providing accurate information that enables informed decision-making about energy choices. The goal isn't to eliminate all fear or concern about nuclear technology, but to ensure that public attitudes are based on factual understanding rather than misperception or outdated information. When communities understand how nuclear technology actually works and what safety measures protect them, they can make wise decisions about their energy future based on knowledge rather than fear. As our gentle journey through the world of nuclear accidents draws to a peaceful close, I hope you're feeling that quiet sense of understanding that comes when complex mysteries transform into familiar friends. We've traveled together through some of humanity's most challenging moments with atomic energy. But more importantly, we've discovered the remarkable capacity for learning, growth, and healing that emerges from even our most difficult experiences. The atoms that seemed so mysterious and frightening at the beginning of our story have revealed themselves to be ancient companions, carrying the memory of stars and the promise of energy that can serve humanity's needs when approached with wisdom and respect. The accidents we've explored tonight, from Chernobyl's dramatic awakening to 3 Mile Island's gentle warning, from Fukushima's earthquake lessons to the forgotten stories of Kishtim and Windscale, each one has contributed to our collective understanding of how to live safely with atomic energy. These weren't just technological failures, but opportunities for humanity to mature in its relationship with one of the universe's most fundamental forces. Every mistake taught us something new about reactor design, human factors, emergency response, or environmental recovery. Every hero who walked into radioactive danger to protect others demonstrated the courage and compassion that make us proud to be human. The invisible nature of radiation, which makes nuclear accidents so uniquely frightening, also makes the recovery and healing process particularly hopeful. We've seen how nature quietly reclaims contaminated areas, how human bodies repair radiation damage, and how communities rebuild their lives with resilience and determination. The exclusion zones that once seemed like permanent scars on the landscape have become accidental nature preserves where wildlife thrives and forests flourish. This gentle healing happens not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient, persistent processes that have sustained life on Earth for billions of years. The international cooperation that emerges during nuclear crises reveals something beautiful about human nature. Our instinctive understanding that some challenges are too important for competition or nationalism. When atoms go wrong, the world's nuclear experts work together as a global family, sharing knowledge, resources, and expertise across political boundaries. The lessons learned in Ukraine benefit reactor operators in Japan, medical techniques developed in America helped patients in Brazil, and safety improvements discovered in Britain protect communities everywhere. This cooperation demonstrates that nuclear technology, despite being developed by individual nations, ultimately belongs to all humanity. The technological improvements that have emerged from nuclear accidents represent one of humanity's greatest achievements: the ability to transform painful experiences into protective wisdom. Modern reactor designs incorporate decades of learning about what can go wrong and how to prevent it. Emergency response procedures have been refined through real-world experience with nuclear crises. Medical treatments for radiation exposure have been developed and tested through caring for accident victims. Each improvement makes nuclear technology safer for future generations, ensuring that the sacrifices made by accident victims contribute to protecting others. Perhaps most importantly, our exploration of nuclear accidents has revealed the extraordinary resilience of both human communities and natural ecosystems when faced with technological challenges. Families displaced by nuclear accidents have rebuilt their lives with courage and hope. Medical professionals have developed treatments that help bodies heal from radiation exposure. Environmental scientists have documented nature's remarkable capacity for recovery and renewal. These stories of healing and adaptation provide comfort and confidence for anyone who worries about humanity's ability to manage powerful technologies responsibly. The future of nuclear technology looks brighter. Because of the wisdom gained from past accidents, new reactor designs are inherently safer, international cooperation is stronger, and public understanding is more sophisticated than ever before. The young engineers and scientists working in nuclear technology today carry with them the accumulated knowledge of every accident, every improvement, and every success that has come before. They approach atomic energy with both respect for its power and confidence in humanity's ability to harness it safely for the benefit of all. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the atoms in your body are the same atoms that have been dancing through the universe since the beginning of time. They've witnessed the birth and death of stars, the formation of planets, and the emergence of life itself. The nuclear energy that occasionally goes wrong in our power plants is the same energy that powers the sun, warms the earth, and makes life possible. Understanding this connection helps us see nuclear accidents not as evidence that atomic energy is inherently dangerous, but as reminders that even the most powerful forces in the universe can be gently guided by human wisdom and care. Sleep peacefully, knowing that each nuclear accident has made the world a little safer. Each lesson learned has protected future generations, and each act of courage during nuclear crises has demonstrated the best of human nature. The atoms around you continue their ancient dance, mostly in perfect harmony, watched over by people who have learned to guide their energy with growing wisdom and deepening compassion. Sweet dreams, my friend, and thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the complex but ultimately hopeful world of nuclear technology.